Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from tea to what I know will be a very special treat for us to end a good day. And I'm very pleased indeed to be able to introduce to you Professor Richard Beilfuss, who, again, you've seen from the photograph, had the great pleasure of meeting personally for the first time in Dakar in Senegal, PAOC, although he and Phil Hall have been friends for many years. Rich is President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Crane Foundation, which is an NGO working worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems upon which they depend. He's a professional hydrologist by training, with a focus on environmental issues, working in many countries, and he's also adjunct professor for the University of Wisconsin-Madison College of Engineering. Rich has lived and worked in Africa for 25 years, including 16 as Africa Program Director for the Crane Foundation and 4 years in Mozambique as Director of Scientific Services in the Gorongosa National Park. He also tells me that he passes his time as an avid unicycle rider, a dart thrower, and a birder, but not all at the same time. Although I'm sure he's a supreme multitasker, and a great pleasure to invite him up to the podium to speak to us now.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me okay through this? All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to meet Richard and see Phil again after 20 or something years down at the PAOC and see others there as well. It's a great get-together every 4 years. If you'll allow me to indulge you a little bit beyond the world of Africa, opening up here, I want to start off here, start off my talk here with kind of a big picture view of why this crane business, why do we focus on cranes, talk a little bit about some of the big ideas behind cranes more broadly that kind of draw us into this world, and then it will drill down, talk about cranes and conservation in Africa, and present some stories at the end of what I hope are sort of some, I guess some optimism I will share, but share some optimism from some of the work on the ground in Africa and try and give you a sense going forward of some of the ways that we get pulled into crane conservation work and some of the broader issues that it leads us to. So sort of start off, why cranes? Cranes are really a stunning family of birds. There's 15 species in the crane world. Of course, they're very visually striking as the tallest birds on Earth that fly. Very easy to discern in the field. They do these wonderful courtship dances around the world in Asia and Africa and North America that draws fanciful cultural comparisons. They're great parents. They raise precocial chicks, and they do dual parenting. They cross and traverse magnificent landscapes. This is across Bhutan with the black-necked crane. They have fantastic flyways. And they have some very remarkable congregations. The Eurasian cranes over on this side of the world, the sandhill cranes in North America reach hundreds of thousands, and they awe-inspiring congregations. And of course, they lead us to some of the most beautiful places on Earth as well. So for all these reasons, cranes have really captured the lure and the history of society for a very long way back. And cranes are actually mentioned in the Bible. They're mentioned in the Quran, and they're mentioned in the Hindu epic text, the foundational text of Hinduism. The story of Buddha discovering suffering is over the shooting of a crane. So they have these deep, deep cultural connections. And because of that, everywhere we work around the world, you find these strong cultural connections from Aboriginal art in the Americas to coins and money and products. And this is an oil company in Vietnam, believe it or not, that uses the SARS crane. So you find this worldwide, this strong cultural connection. And if you question whether that extends to Africa, I think you need to look no further than Uganda, which is crane central of the world. This is, of course, their national football team, the Cranes. They're in the center of the Ugandan flag, as many of you know, have been on currency and this and that. The bank, National Bank, of course, is the Crane Bank. So very strong. But as I'll talk about today, there's a paradox. There's this history, this richness, this connection to cranes, almost this sort of mythological, deep sense of connection. And yet, it's one of the most endangered family of birds on Earth. It's kind of the great paradox of cranes. This is just a quick rundown at the global picture of cranes. 11 of the 15 species of cranes are endangered. Of the 4 that are not, they all have significantly threatened populations or are in decline. And so cranes are loved, and yet we've struggled globally to translate that love into conservation action and conservation success on the ground. There are 3 ideas that I think are sort of central to our world of crane conservation that really direct how we focus in our programs worldwide. And again, a little bit of a paradox here in that cranes as very large birds on the landscape are unusually good indicators in a number of places. We often think of indicator species as small, inconspicuous things, tadpoles and mud minnows and all, that may have a very tight environmental relationship, but a number of crane species actually have very, very tight environmental connections, including the wattled crane on the large floodplains of southern Africa. They feed almost exclusively on the tubers of one sedge species, Eleocharis. That's a large part of their diet. That species only produces tubers when you have a natural ebb and flow of water in the right hydrological conditions, or the plant dies out or fails to produce food. So they're large, and they have a somewhat mixed diet, but they're quite dependent on a fairly narrow, restricted plant species. The second idea behind this, and of course this links directly to their strong cultural links, is the role of cranes as ambassadors for conservation, bringing people together. And we find that over and over around the world. We actually have an active program with North and South Koreans working together on crane conservation across the DMZ. Rather unusual alliance these days. We work with groups of students and researchers from all over the world. We call them craniacs, and we try to harness their energy and bring them together all over. There are worldwide more than 100 festivals celebrating cranes. This is in Bhutan, where children come from the surrounding hillsides to this temple, and of all ages dress and do mating dances and all sorts of fun stuff related to cranes. And we have these festivals repeated on 5 continents. And the third idea behind sort of global crane conservation, I think that's significant, is their role as flagships. And I think there are certain places where the value of cranes kind of transcends their value as an endangered species, drawing focus from a purely conservation standpoint. I think that they're a focal point for saving broader wetlands and ecosystems where a lot of broader conservation good can be done. A great example is the saris crane across India and Vietnam, where it's probably the single most important species of bird or mammal for securing small wetlands on the landscape, and lots of bird species of sort of maybe lesser societal interest that depend on these same systems. And of course, the conservation of cranes draws us into all the same issues we're talking about today, and we talk about at all of these meetings on birds, dealing with water control structures, invasive species, loss and degradation of habitat and watersheds, grazing and human interactions. All these same issues come to fold in the crane conservation world, to be sure. And finally, I think they're also serving to be flagships for human-wildlife interaction as well. A lot of the solutions for cranes center around conservation-friendly livelihoods and recognizing, in many cases, the sacrifices that people have to make to keep cranes on their landscape and the ways in which that we and they can benefit together. So those are sort of the 3 central themes behind what we do. And now I'll drill down, talk a little bit about cranes in Africa, kind of an overview of the species, and then go a little bit more specifically into their conservation. There's 6 species of cranes that occur across Africa. 2 are wintering species and 4 are resident. I'll just talk very briefly about the 2 wintering species. One is the Eurasian crane that also comes through Europe here. Eurasian cranes winter along the coast up here. There's some good numbers in Tunisia and across Algeria. And then a fairly significant population winters down in Ethiopia, where this was taken. And you can see up to tens of thousands in Ethiopia in some winters, not all. Not a lot of conservation work happening on the bird. They're wide-ranging, relatively stable, huge numbers across India and China in winter as well. And the other winter visitor to Africa is the demoiselle crane. They also come down, unfortunately, they make heavy use of South Sudan parts of far western Ethiopia and across into Chad, and their wintering population. Still good numbers, but very unknown. As I'll talk about in a minute, this population, which is also where a lot of the black-crowned cranes winter, is an area where we have great concern and not a lot of information. So the 4 resident species of cranes, the black-crowned crane of West Africa, and across to Central Africa and Ethiopia, the gray-crowned crane starting in East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, going down to South Africa, the wattled crane in the big floodplains of South Central Africa with satellite populations in South Africa and up in Ethiopia, and the blue crane, mostly endemic to South Africa with a small population up in Namibia. These are the 4 that we put most of our attention on and work in broad partnerships with many organizations, some represented here, to try and save these birds and the landscapes that they occur in. The gray-crowned crane is probably the crane that may be most familiar to everyone in this room, and it's actually probably the most alarming story in the crane world of the last 40 years. They've been in very precipitous decline, a species that most people consider to be common. A lot of people that grew up in Africa or know Kenya and Uganda well thought of it as a bird everybody saw. People who would visit into Tanzania or into Queen Elizabeth Park or other places were used to seeing them in huge numbers, but they've actually been in a very, very significant decline, and they've moved from least concern through fully to endangered in the last 10 years with a more than 80% decline across range. And for those who've been to Uganda and Kenya, you know the degree to which they've disappeared from being an abundant bird on that landscape to a much, much rarer bird. And the reasons for that are complex, but 2 big ones. I think one is they're being loved to death. There are huge numbers going out into international trade, some going out of Africa, and a lot actually staying in Africa. They're being domesticated, and they're often kept on compounds, kind of like peacocks. They stay on compounds or like chickens. In other cases, they adorn hotels, restaurants. We have a project in Rwanda right now where we've marked 280 cranes in captivity just in the capital, Kigali. And the total estimated population in the country of Rwanda now is under 200. So there are more in captivity now than in the wild. And parts of southwestern Uganda are heading that way too, going out, and eastern Congo as well. So one of the big challenges is just stemming trade, getting birds that can be rehabilitated back into the wild and trying to deal with that. The other big challenge with the gray-crowned crane is just the gradual but persistent loss of wetlands across the landscape. Uganda, for example, has very good wetland programs, but there's still the sort of inexorable march of human development across the region is leading to fewer and fewer wetlands. So we find ourselves involved very heavily in community-based wetland conservation approaches to try and find compatible ways for people to live on the landscape with gray-crowned cranes throughout this area. So a lot of our work there focuses on that. The black-crowned crane has had a fairly similar fate across West and Central Africa as the gray-crowned. Its decline began a bit earlier. Really, black-crowned cranes were in decline across Nigeria and parts of West Central Africa, probably back into the late 60s, early 70s. It's a hugely unknown population here because of this big concentration right here. There was an aerial survey report in the 1950s of about 50,000 crowned cranes in this part of Sudan, but this is a great, that historic number is based on this one count, and I actually dug out the paper, and it was based on an observed total of less than 10,000 birds in an extrapolated count. So, in fact, there's very little known about what this number might be like. We had plans to go in and work with Wildlife Conservation Society and do surveys there just a few years ago, and then, as you know, the area has become inflamed again now, and it's very, very difficult to learn anything about what's happening. But from the areas that we do know, and I'll get to this more in a minute with another map, the species is in decline almost everywhere across its range. This is a shot I took from the Casamance just a couple months ago when we were in Senegal for the PAOC. And they're still hanging on in fairly good numbers there, but a lot of the trends that are happening on the broader landscape in West Africa, sea level rise, increasing salinization of these floodplains is coming to bear in this area. And it's hard to get our minds around what may be triggering decline fully in the area, but a lot of trends are concerning. There are some wonderful people working in West Africa, like Adrissa, shown here with Wetlands International, and some very dedicated effort to try and hang on to the birds in Senegal and in Ethiopia, where we have active programs trying to raise awareness about the birds and help their conservation. But overall, it's a very, very challenging map and region. If you look at the distribution here again of crowned cranes across the region, and then this is an overlaid map of some of the major insurgencies and then war zones in South Sudan. And they're almost perfectly correlated, except at the extreme fringe of their range, with a lot of the political disturbance and other challenges that are happening across Africa. We're having quite a depressing dinner conversation chat last night about Waza. This used to be the home of probably 4,000 to 5,000 great crowned cranes, and there's evidence there may be very few left here. Mali, Inner Niger Delta had perhaps 50,000 in the 1970s based on surveys, certainly 20 or 30,000 well-known population, and there are none left in the wild that we know of in the Inner Niger Delta. So real challenges across this core range, but some bit of hope in Ethiopia and on the coast of Senegal. The blue crane has been very well studied and the center of a lot of great conservation activity for a long time in South Africa. It's the success story of the 4 African cranes right now. Population continues to increase. It's vulnerable, but increasing rapidly. The count is now well over 25,000 birds in South Africa, so it's been a very good story. The biggest challenge with crowned cranes going forward is their unique distribution on the coast and the way that they've adapted to winter wheat on the South African coast in the Fynbos sort of region, Cape region of South Africa. That's one of the climate change hotspots of the world. And so a lot of the reason they remain vulnerable and of concern, even though the numbers are growing well, is a lot of uncertainty about the future of that landscape and how it will translate over time if the climate shifts more and cropping patterns change and a lot of the interactions between cranes in those landscapes change over time. So it is a bird that is showing us a lot of hope, but is also remains of concern as well. So I'm going to focus the rest of my discussion here and some of my stories on the wattled crane. The wattled crane is a bird of South Central Africa, shown here, and then there's some peripheral populations in Ethiopia and down in South Africa. Really, at its core, it's a bird of these large floodplains, and it depends on some of the biggest and most important floodplain systems of Africa. And the challenges of those systems are large as well. Big dams, some of the biggest dams in Africa, altering water and water flows in those giant floodplain systems. Concomitant with the drying of the floodplains resulting from big dams, we've had invasions like Mimosa pigra, which is a major challenge I'll get to, fires, which may be natural on the landscape, but are much more intense and frequent than they were when conditions were wetter in those systems, so often destroying eggs and nests. And human encroachment onto these floodplains as well. Again, the need to find these compatible livelihoods between people and cranes and other biodiversity. The wattled crane story is basically going to be told on 5 big floodplains of Africa. You currently have about 80% of their global population now focused in 5 places, probably even more. One is the Kafue Flats. We had one of the highest counts there in about 30 years, a couple of years ago. Still fairly good numbers on the flats, pushing 3,000 birds. That would be about a third of their global population. The Lua Plain out west, where you have high numbers of wattled cranes and gray crowned cranes out on these pans out there. The Okavango Delta, which still has about 1,200 birds, probably the most secure floodplain that wattled cranes occur in, largely due to the high-end tourism out there that's created a lot of economic and governance support for the Delta. The Bangwelu swamps, where you still have about 1,000 birds, though they're in decline there. That's also home of the shoebell we saw earlier, the unique bird, and good numbers of wattled cranes and endemic black lechwe, huge floodplain system, still with fairly good numbers of wattled cranes. And then finally, the Zambezi Delta. It's a place where I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years. Still fairly good numbers there. It's the 5th biggest population in Africa of about 400, but at times it has eruptive populations of more than 2,000 when it provides unique conditions not found elsewhere in the region. So it can be quite a critical floodplain in certain years, but not all years. So those are the big five across there. And a lot of our work trying to secure these five floodplains is kind of reflective of global work on cranes and the different issues that they lead us to. So I thought I would just illustrate quickly a few examples of crane conservation in these big floodplains and give you a sense of how these approaches work. So I'll talk a little bit about invasive species, about environmental flows, about balancing human use in wetlands, and about the great need, which we've been hearing for a lot today, about capacity, awareness, and advocacy for conservation. Start with a story from the Kafue Flats, trying to link invasive species control with poverty alleviation. Over the the invasive shrub mimosa has been present in the Kafue Flats back into historic records, but in very low distribution and very low impact. And then it's exploded over the last 20 years. And somewhat insidiously, it covers the floodplain edge, the flood drawdown edge of the plains where lechwe and also wattled cranes are highly dependent, especially as we move deeper and deeper into the dry season each year. So when you look at its distribution globally across a place like the Kafue Flats, it appears fairly limited in total land cover, maybe 10% of land cover. But when you look at this, its critical feeding area, both for lechwe and wattled crane, it really occupies a very, very important belt. This is dense lechwe seen from the air throughout here all along this open lagoon area. And you see this banding all along Chunga Lagoon and areas to the north, right at that forefront of where water levels draw down and create prime habitat for species during the dry season. So the program we have there is to try and employ people from the local community to cut and remove mimosa. There's a huge demand for employment in the area because there's very, very little opportunity outside of subsistence farming. And so people come in and are actually cutting and removing the mimosa and are paid to do this. And then we work with them to try and reinvest the money that they're earning off of that into local microfinance opportunities. So when we had the first round of mimosa control in this area, people reinvested in livestock and in small shops and things. We're trying to encourage that to try and develop some viable, more lasting livelihoods out of maintaining and controlling mimosa on the floodplain. And the idea is to continue to monitor this area and try and track this opening up and use it to create a national awareness about mimosa as what's being classified as a national disaster in Zambia because of its threat not only to biodiversity, but to cattle grazing on the floodplain and other human activities, fisheries access, and so on. Try to recast the invasive species as a national economic disaster, and in doing so, try to open it up for people and for wildlife and greater use. So it's an example of trying to go deep in trying to open up this area, but really engage the local community and trying to create real value for the control of the plant. Both for the Kafue Flats and the Zambezi Delta, an issue we've been working on for now more than 20 years is trying to get the water right, trying to get hydrological flows back in these systems. The Zambezi Delta, the Zambezi region as a whole has about 80 to 90% of the world's wattled cranes, and they're concentrated on those big floodplains I mentioned, many of them linked to Zambezi flows. And they also have three of the biggest dams in Africa. Certainly, this is Kohora Bassa Dam, major dam on the system, also Kariba Dam, altering Zambezi flows, and the Teji Teji and Kafue Gorge dams on the Kafue Flats. This is the spread of important areas throughout the Zambezi Basin and some of the critical places where we work. And of course, hydropower dams are critical for power. Many people who follow the region know there's been a lot of brownouts from South Africa up through Zambia. Power is critical in the region. There's no turning back the clock on that. But what we're trying to work towards is a different view of hydropower in the region where it's one of many benefits delivered to these broader ecosystems and not the only benefit. Most of these dams went in and they are operated 100% optimized for hydropower at the expense of all other uses. So a lot of the work we've been trying to do is raise the other values and show the value of altering and shifting from 100% hydropower-based perspective to a more mixed-use perspective that still meets energy needs. We started documenting back in the 1990s the impacts of these dams on the ecosystems that they affect downstream and upstream. degradation related to flows and sediments and water quality, huge changes. This is in Mozambique, downstream of Cahora Bassa, but huge changes over time in the river and in its flooding patterns. And corresponding, a lot of effort trying to document the ways in which biodiversity and the fundamental services provided by these floodplains have been altered due to these large dams, and really demonstrate that over time. But also, and equally importantly, demonstrating the human impact of these hydrologic changes. And rather than pitting this as birds versus dams or water for people versus water for birds, changing the argument to water for some people and not for other people. It's about who are the winners and losers in the management of water, and trying to recast that argument in a framework where conservation has a voice. And a lot of impacts from these dams, which I'll illustrate in a minute, but to fishing, to floodplain agriculture, to resource use on the floodplains. And that's not only affecting current use of the downstream ecosystems and the well-being that comes from them, but also for the capacity of people to deal with climate change as it's happening in the region. Some of you may be aware, but the Zambezi Basin has been classified as the worst impacted of the 11 major river basins in Africa. From modeling work a number of people have been doing, it's showing dramatic reductions in water availability over time. Some of the projections, there are even worse projections than this, but we've had projections of 26 to 40% reduction in water availability within the basin over the next 50 to 100 years through changing climates. Hit very hard across parts of Western Zambia, Botswana, up into Angola. And so that has a big impact on the future of hydropower and power production in the region, and also all life that depends on these floodplains and on this basin. So we've had a big program now running for a long time, working with the operators of the dams in the region and other partners to try and look at, as I mentioned, what the impact of these river changes has been on these ecosystems, really understand how it affected wattled cranes, but a whole suite of species and human activities in areas, and try to really answer the fundamental question, is there enough water available still to do anything about it? And if there is, are there trade-offs among different users, or are there real compatibilities between what people need in the system and what wildlife needs, that you can come up with real solutions? So how much water is available? How much water does the river need to really function, and can you get it? So we focused quite a bit on wattled cranes, certainly how much water it would take to really sustain and support and increase numbers of wattled cranes. On flood-dependent agriculture, both on the floodplain and on the riverbanks in the system, trying to understand the economic value of that for floods. On freshwater fisheries, where there's been enormous losses across this system just due to lack of flooding, lack of the annual flood pulse. In Mozambique, on coastal shrimp fisheries and the way that declining Zambezi runoff below the dams has affected the #3 export earner in the country of Mozambique, trying to pull all these pieces together. And as we put together this puzzle over the years of these different water users and these different water benefits, both economic and cultural, as well as ecological, an interesting pattern emerged, which is that if you look at optimized hydropower, if the system's managed only for hydropower, all of these disparate users show significant economic loss. But when you look at modest allocations of water to meet downstream flows and really try to rejuvenate these floodplains, and you look at hydropower as part of an optimized system, you can still meet the hydropower needs in the region through these dams, so with more than 95% of current production, but you can meet a whole suite of other needs in the system, or at least advance towards improvement in a whole suite of other needs in the system by trying to get the water at better times and in a more balanced way downstream. So we've had a lot of focus on this, trying to build this at an institutional level, build community support for bringing water back to the system, and just trying to really figure out what is the right water for these big floodplain systems. How do you get it back in, and can you institutionalize it by building enough support broadly across the different sectors of society? Another example up in Lua, trying to balance wetland use. These pans are scattered all across Lua. If you've been out there, they have these beautiful pans dotting the landscape. There's actually more than 300 of them all throughout this landscape in the upper Zambezi Basin. And the Lua is also home to one of the biggest concentrations of wildebeest in Africa, second only to the Serengeti, and also big numbers of wattled cranes and endangered gray-crowned cranes as well. So these pans are the main water source for the wildebeest. They're the breeding sites for wattled and gray-crowned cranes. And they're also, every single one of them has a water right given to communities from the Baratsi, the Lodzi community of that region. And so every single pan that meets these critical wildlife needs also has a special and permitted human use as well. So it's an intensely used system, even though it's in a national park. The value of these fisheries to the local people is extraordinary. They pull out fish, they come in and fish seasonally every year and pull it out. So a lot of our focus there, working with African parks, with the Baratsi community and WWF, is really trying to see if we can find a core compatibility between this heavy fishing use of the pans and the breeding success, both of wattled and gray-crowned cranes. And the good news there, and it is a good news story, is there are good compatibilities there. And with minor tweaking of the timing of fishing activities in this system, you actually find it's got among the highest breeding success for gray-crowns and wattled cranes in the Zambezi system, and is able to still meet these needs. So as long as the birds aren't directly removed or persecuted by people, there is compatibility between people coming in and heavily using these wetlands and drawing real value from them, and the cranes and other species being able to carry on. So there are some stories of hope and success out there in a sea of challenges. And the final big piece as we look out across is this core need to really build capacity. There is tremendous capacity in this region, but trying to steer it towards building a love for these places and really building a sense of support. And again, turning back to the Kafue Flats, I can't think of any better example than what's happening in the flats right now. There's geothermal drilling, and there's actually cement. There is mining for gypsum happening right in this national park. And the reason it's not happening in the park, well, it's not happening in adjacent outside areas, and instead is happening right in the park, is it's a low-hanging fruit. There's not enough community support, not enough government support for the park to push activities outside, so they're just directed right inside the park. So if you look at this geothermal drilling operation coming in right in Kafue National Park, Kafue Flats right here, if you look at this tree line, this is where you see large populations of wattle cranes right there. We counted more than 150 gray-crowned cranes, which would be a significant portion of the population in the country, right in this system. So a lot of our focus going forward in these areas is trying to find ways through to build a love and a social push for these systems to protect them. And part of that is going to come through use of these wetlands without a doubt, through mixed use and through some of the ways that I've been talking about, whether environmental flows or fishing rights or different activities, finding compatible uses that will build that support from people, but trying to find ways that will keep some of these bigger, very large-scale threats out so these can continue to function as healthy ecosystems. And I think it's a critical role as we talk about capacity and advocacy in the region, is to really build that fundamental awareness that will sustain the majority of parks that aren't the Okavangos and maybe the Luangwas that are the huge high-end tourism breadwinners, but the broader parks that really provide so much biodiversity across the region. We work a lot with partners all over, like I said, some in the room here, and I just want to acknowledge them. A lot of great things happening across Africa. Like I said, I'm an optimist, but I take victory in a lot of the small stories of success that are happening out there. I think there is a lot of good news to share. I'm grateful to, these are just some of our supporters in the last couple of years, but a lot of people who invest in conservation and cranes and the broader landscapes that they live in. And I thank you. Thank
you very much. Absolutely fascinating talk, and I can open the lecture for questions.
Yeah.
What do you know about the movements of the individuals between breeding seasons and outside breeding?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was just chatting over lunch with Bob Doothwaite, who's out here somewhere, who was working in the Kafue Flats in the 1970s, and we talked a lot about what historical distribution looked like and present distribution looked like. And so it varies by species. For wattled cranes, generally speaking, they're probably staying within each of those large systems on an annual basis, but they're periodically erupting out. So one big example is the Makati Plains of Botswana, where there's been records of 2,500, 3,000 wattle cranes once every 10 or 15 years, and almost no use in other years. So there's these certain critical wetlands out there that can be heavily used, but only rarely in those instances. And then you have other systems like the Kafui that seem to be year after year supporting the majority of the population. So I don't think there's a clearly defined seasonal movement. They're clearly breeding and using all of those systems year-round, but there's small populations, probably pre-breeding juveniles especially, that are kind of ranging out and using wider areas. We're still trying to kind of nail that down and see if there's broader conservation implication for that, if we need to be focusing in some places outside of these systems. But as far as we can tell, if they're moving, they're mostly moving within these systems, which are enormous, but definitely moving around within them to take advantage of resources. It's probably a similar story for gray crown cranes. And the difficult challenge with the crown cranes is their movement is more food related, and they will roost and breed in wetlands, but move out into agricultural fields, and that's where they're especially exposed, is when they move out into agricultural areas. They come into conflict over farms or poisonings or other things. So there's other dynamics there. Yeah.
What are you doing about the capture of cranes for export or for local domestic use? What can be done about that?
Yeah, quite a bit. We started off doing research to really get our minds around the problem. And there was a particularly good study in Mali that was done actually before things kind of blew up there in the Inner Niger Delta. And the team we worked with, it was Wetlands International team, we found that of every crane that was captured in the wild in the Inner Niger Delta and eventually made it back to market, we were losing 8 to 9 out of 10 of those birds just in the transport. So one of the things it clicked us onto is it started to explain this massive decline that was happening across the region. We just couldn't find enough cranes in households, in domestic compounds, in hotels to explain the scale, tens of thousands that were being lost. But when we started to really look at the die-off numbers, what people do in the Inner Niger Delta is they grab chicks, they throw them in a burlap sack, as many as they can hold, and they'll march them across the plain for a day or two, walking out to get to places where they'll go then and sit into market. And if there's if they're trying to avoid people, they'll hide them through this, and then they'll go and they'll be chained up by the leg in these markets. So you have very high mortality, and they're fed a terrible diet, and so on and so forth. So the first issue was really getting an understanding of that. And I think the program that we have in Kigali and Rwanda kind of epitomizes how we can get around this issue. The guy we work with there, Olivier Nessengema, was able to get the government to approve of a permitting program where every single bird in captivity in Kigali was banded and registered and grandfathered in, about 270 birds. But any bird now found in captivity there that's not banded is then subject to full prosecution under Rwandan law, which is the same law that would apply in Uganda and Kenya and even in Tanzania if it was enforced. And so then what we're doing is a triage of those birds in captivity, and those that are still reasonably healthy are being pulled out, rehabilitated at a veterinary clinic, and re-released at Akagera National Park in the far eastern part of Rwanda on the border with Tanzania. So it's an example of what we can do if there's enough government will to support a program like that to get the birds back out. And then we're doing quite a bit of work in China to understand the demand into China and the demand into the Middle East. We found orders for 500 wild-caught black crown cranes in China. So we know that there's still that demand. But my take is that there's probably more to be done with domesticity within Africa than in international. We can shut down a lot of the international demand, but the domestic demand is very, very high all across for black crown and gray crown. And that's kind of where we're targeting more, like that program in Kigali, trying to deal with that. But where laws can, we're starting up a national awareness campaign in Uganda, and you couldn't have a more crane-centric place, but trying to translate that into the firm kind of law that Rwanda's had the stomach for is the key. We really hope Rwanda can be an example to the region of turning the corner when there's government will to get these birds back out. Fish.
I think you may have answered my question, but I was going to ask whether there were any connection in the upswing in trade is related to the Chinese, because I was in Guinea a few years ago and anecdotally was told that there were collections there. I saw some captivity and I was told it was because of sudden increase in local demand by the Chinese for these birds. And obviously what applied to the Chinese in Guinea would apply to the Chinese elsewhere.
Yeah, we haven't really begun to get our minds around the demand by the Chinese living in Africa, which is what you're saying, actually. You mean living in Africa or taking them out?
Both, really.
Yeah.
Taking on the Chinese, whether it's going into local consumption of dollars or
yeah. Well, we know Guinea and Tanzania in the west, or in the east, and Guinea are the two biggest export hubs. We know that a lot of birds are not checked at airports, and often when the black-crowned crane was first listed under CITES, they were being shipped out even into Europe here, to be honest, and they were relabeled from black-crowned to gray-crowned in Belgium and the Netherlands, and then shipped out from there, and nobody can tell the difference between a black-crowned and a gray-crowned. So they just relabel them and avoid CITES listing that way. Now we've got both species listed, so it's closed that down. But I think we can, by and large, because the international demand is mostly safaris and zoos, it's probably a demand that can be managed and reduced pretty strongly. We do a lot of work in China, so it's actually our Chinese crane team that's working on the trade issues there and trying to identify and lower trade there. But I think the process of getting them to market is such a big impact on the birds in the region. So it's a difficult one to get around there for sure. But we've tried pretty hard to get the export ports in Tanzania and Guinea better monitored. There's a CITES significant trade review in both places trying to push down on that, but they are institutional in nature. Some of that trade is very difficult to shut all of it down. Questions?
Questions? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, to close what I believe has been another thoroughly enjoyable Members' Day, I would like to thank Rich, of course, but all our speakers today who have really thrilled us, I think, with their erudition, flair, illustration, and the sheer efforts made by many to actually be here to give us the benefit of all this enjoyment. I must again thank the staff of the Natural History Museum for all they've done, and also all my council colleagues who put so much into the work that has preceded this event, as they do every year. But most of all, obviously, I would like to thank you, the audience, members, guests, because without your attendance, the whole thing would be pointless. And I'm very grateful to you for being here, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I wish you a safe and easy trip home. And we'll look forward to seeing you at Bird Fair, and hopefully again here next year for the next Members' Day. So thank you all very much.